Hello and welcome to our Sunday morning Bible class at the Carthage Church of Christ. Whether you're joining us live on Sunday morning or watching this later, we appreciate you taking the time to view this video, and we appreciate those who have helped in the recording, Jeremy and Justin, and all the work that they do. We're studying this quarter the book of Hebrews, and this morning we're looking at the second half of Hebrews chapter 11. You'll probably recognize Hebrews 11 as being that Faith's Hall of Fame chapter that we talk about. It happens to be my wife's favorite chapter, and certainly there are a lot of things that we take out of the examples that are given concerning the Old Testament characters who are mentioned in Hebrews 11. The author of Hebrews uses these characters to illustrate what faith looks like. And what jumps out of the pages to me is the obvious connection that he makes between faith and obedience. And Johnny talked about that last week in his lesson, where he looked at the first 22 verses of Hebrews 11, and we're going to look at the last part of Hebrews 11, and that continues that connection between faith and obedience. You look at the verb tense that is used among these Old Testament characters. Abel offered a more excellent sacrifice. Noah moved and prepared. Abraham went. Moses kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood. Those verbs show that there is a connection between faith and obedience. We know, and the Hebrews writer points out, that we're not saved by works. We're not saved by works of merit, but neither are we saved just by giving mental assent, just by saying that we believe in God and never doing anything about it. There is a connection and a must-have, for lack of a better phrasing, between faith and obedience. You can't necessarily have one without the other. Now, these individuals, they're obedient individuals who stand as examples of biblical faith and serve to inspire us. And that's one of the things I hope we get out of this lesson, is that when we are feeling maybe a lack of faith, or we're feeling weak, or we're feeling less confident in our own selves, here are some examples that we can go to and look at men and women who came before us and endured, in many cases, a lot of suffering, a lot of terrible things, and yet they remained faithful through that. And if we can look at some of those examples, maybe that will help us strengthen our own faith that we can finish this race that we are running. Because in the Bible, we can learn from negative examples, we can learn what not to do, but certainly when it comes to the people mentioned in this chapter, we learn how we should act and the kind of faith that we should have. Now, our reading this morning, what we're covering is Hebrews 11, verses 23 through 40, and we may actually bleed over a little bit into chapter 12. And so I'm going to break it down into three sections to maybe organize it a little bit in our lesson this morning. We'll begin with the first section, verses 23 through 29, looking at the faith of Moses. So I'd encourage you to read this with me. Beginning in Hebrews 11:23, it says, "By faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents, because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command. By faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called a son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians, attempting to do so, were drowned." Now, I said that this section was about the faith of Moses, but in fact, when you read that first verse, verse 23, it's actually alluding to the faith of his parents. His parents Amram and Jochebed are mentioned not by name, but they're alluded to because they hid Moses for 3 months. Now, why did they have to do that? Well, you might remember there was a decree that came down from Pharaoh that the young male children would be killed, if you could imagine that. And rather than following that command, they hid Moses, and that took faith. Well, why did it take faith? Well, imagine what would have happened if they had been caught. Moses would have been killed anyway, and probably his parents as well. So it took some amount of courage for them to defy the authorities and do the right thing. And maybe this is one of the first examples that we have in the Scriptures of civil disobedience, of disobeying governmental man-made authority in order to follow the will of God. And hopefully we never are put in that situation, but many have been throughout history, and many probably are today. And so here's an example of something that was obviously against the will of God, the death of these small children, and they defied the Pharaoh's command, showing that faith in the process. So they're mentioned, and then of course it talks about Moses and his early life after he was hidden. Remember, he was found and became basically a child of Pharaoh's daughter, was raised in Pharaoh's house, and could have, I guess, spent his entire life living that luxurious, privileged life and doing very well. But in Exodus chapter 2 and verse 11, it says, he went out to his brethren and looked at their burdens. And so he saw the slavery and the terrible things. He saw the Egyptian beating the Hebrew servant. And at that moment, there was a choice that Moses had to make. Am I going to continue to live this easy lifestyle while my brethren, while God's people suffer, or am I going to do the right thing? And so when the Hebrews writer says that he chose to suffer affliction with the people of God rather than enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about that decision that he had to make to side with the people of God and to serve God rather than just living life and living it up in Pharaoh's house. You can divide the life of Moses into 3 time periods. He lived to 120, and so basically the first 40 years he was a son of Pharaoh's daughter, living, learning the ways of the Egyptians, and then at 40, that's when he saw the burdens of his people, and he killed the Egyptian servant, or the Egyptian who was beating the Hebrew servant rather, and spent the next 40 years in the wilderness with his father Jethro. And then at 80, around age 80, was when he spoke to God at Mount Sinai and spent the last 40 years of his life leading the children of Israel out of Egyptian bondage and towards the promised land. And so many examples of his faith in that process. But one thing I want to touch on, lest I forget, is verse 28. Because sometimes we just read over this, but I think it's worth noting. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. And I thought about that verse, and I thought about the moment when God gave the command to put the blood on the doorpost. The Hebrew people would put blood on the doorpost, and God said, I'll pass over you. But any Egyptian who doesn't have this blood on the doorpost, their firstborn is going to die. And to me, I wonder if some of those Hebrews in their mind, if they didn't vocalize it, maybe at least in their mind, didn't say, now what does blood on a doorpost have to do with the firstborn not being killed? What's the connection there? Why would I do that? Why would I put blood on the doorpost in order to avoid my firstborn dying? I don't see that connection. I don't see that point. Had they not done it, no doubt the firstborn would have died. But the connection in my mind is a lot of people today. I hear this, and maybe you've heard it, maybe you've even said it. I don't see the connection between water and salvation. I don't see the connection between getting wet, getting baptized, and being saved. Despite all the verses that we could mention, Acts 2:38, Romans 6:3 and 4, Mark 16:16, Acts 22:16, Galatians 3:26 and 27, and we could go on and on about all the verses that talk about baptism as being for remission of sins, or baptism as being for salvation, or baptism as being for having your sins washed away. All those things, people just sometimes make the comment, well, I don't see the connection. I don't see the connection between getting wet and salvation. Well, the Hebrews, Moses and the children of Israel, maybe they didn't fully see the connection between that blood on the doorpost and God passing over them and not taking their firstborn, but they did it. And you and I may not understand fully why God chose baptism as part of His plan of salvation, but are we going to have faith enough to take those verses and study those verses and realize that it's not the only part, but it is certainly an essential part of that plan of salvation? So there's one of the things that we can take maybe as an example of the faith of Moses and apply it to our own life today. So let's move on to the second section, verses 30 through 34. There's some others who are mentioned that we want to briefly touch on. The writer says, by faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they were encircled for 7 days. By faith, the harlot Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe when she had received the spies with peace. And what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, and also of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. So he begins this section by referencing Joshua and the Israelites when they attacked Jericho. And if you remember that story, they didn't really use a normal means of attacking a city. They actually marched around the wall one time, the walls of the city one time for 6 days. One time each day for 6 days. And then on the seventh day, they marched around 7 times and shouted and followed the commands that they were given, and the city fell. And you think about the faith that they had, and the word that comes to my mind is a patient faith. They had to have a patient faith, because after marching around the city the first day, the walls didn't fall down. They didn't fall down the second day or the third or the fourth or the fifth or even the sixth. They didn't fall down until they fully obeyed the commands of God. And our faith today, and I'll speak for me personally, not always a patient faith. I'm not always patient. When I don't get what I think I need or what I want, I'm not always patient. And when God doesn't give us exactly what we ask for when we ask, sometimes we lose patience with God. But it could be that God is waiting to give us something better later on. And from these Israelites, in this case, I think we can learn a lesson in patience and faith that, again, something that didn't make a whole lot of sense. Why would you march around a city. How is that going to make the walls fall down? Not a lot of logic there, but there's certainly faith. And they did it because God said to do it. And sometimes we just have to do something because God says do it, rather than trying to maybe justify it in our own minds. Rahab is also mentioned for the risks that she took, and her failure or her sin isn't glossed over. Right? It mentions the fact that she was a harlot. And then it mentions these other people, and they've got something in common too. Gideon is mentioned. You may remember he destroyed idols and was used to defeat a large army of Midianites. Barak, we studied him a couple of quarters ago, led Israel in a dramatic victory over the Canaanites. Samson, that strong man that was always fighting the Philistines. Jephthah was used to defeat the Ammonites. David was the greatest king that Israel ever had. Those people have a couple of things in common. Number one, they're mentioned here in Hebrews 11 as being men of great faith, men and women of great faith, including Rahab. But the second thing they have in common is none of them were perfect. None of them were perfect, and their sins, their shortcomings, their failures are not ignored in the Scriptures. The Bible doesn't ignore the fact that Rahab was a harlot. When we studied Barak, remember, we studied the fact he was told to go and fight on behalf of God, and he told Deborah, well, I'll go if you'll go with me. Didn't really show a lot of courage in that moment. The Bible didn't hide that. Samson, we remember him for physical strength, but we also remember him as being somebody who was arrogant, whose pride led to his destruction. David, the Bible doesn't gloss over his adultery, his lust, his murder. It doesn't hide those things. And so when I read their names here in Hebrews 11, it's a reminder of not only their faith that they had, but also the fact that even though they weren't perfect, the Holy Spirit inspired this writer of Hebrews to include them in this chapter because of their faith. So when you and I are not perfect, which is every day, right? I mean, none of us are perfect. None of us are going to go through life without making mistakes. It's easy to get down on ourselves and feel sorry for ourselves and maybe even be tempted to quit. Maybe we could look at this section in Hebrews 11 and look at some of these individuals as being like us, and the fact that they weren't perfect. They made mistakes, but they didn't quit, and neither should we. Let's look at the last section as we close this morning. Beginning in verse 35, there's some folks here who are alluded to who aren't necessarily mentioned by name, but as we read through this, just think of the things that they went through. Women received their dead raised to life again. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance that they might obtain a better resurrection. Still others had trials of mocking and scourgings, yes, and of chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains, in dens and caves of the earth. And all these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise, God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. And then going into the first verse of chapter 12, therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. You look at what those people went through and read what those people went through, and it's not exactly something that would inspire you to go and follow God, because they went through some terrible, terrible things. And no wonder the author writes in verse 38, of whom the world was not worthy. Because these people that went through these terrible things, that without losing their faith, they were too good for this world. And certainly in their minds, they had something in mind much greater than the world. So when we are tempted to quit as readers of the Bible, here is some encouragement. Here's some encouragement again, not to quit. Some encouragement to keep going. I said these people aren't named. We can piece together who some of them are. We won't mention everybody, but just as an example, we know from reading the Old Testament that the widow of Zarephath and the Shunammite woman had sons raised from the dead, which is alluded to in verse 35. We know that Zechariah, among others, were stoned, which was alluded to in verse 37. Tradition says that Isaiah was actually sawn in two by King Manasseh. And the writer here mentions that there were those who were sawn in two. And maybe that's a reference to Isaiah. We don't know. But even though these people aren't mentioned by name, their works, specifically their faith, is certainly remembered. And the reason we went into verse 1 of chapter 12, of course, the men have put that chapter break in there, but chapter 12, verse 1 is referring back to these people in chapter 11. And he paints a picture, the writer does, of an athletic contest, of a race that we're all in, and these heroes of faith are spectators. They're spectators in the stands watching us, cheering us on in our race to make it to heaven and be the kind of people that the Lord would have us to be. It's important that we learn from those who came before us. If these people who did not receive the promise were this faithful, if you look at verse 39, all these having obtained a good testimony through faith did not receive the promise. They looked forward. They looked towards Jesus coming, but they never saw it. We look backwards in some aspects at the fact that Jesus came, and we look backward with gratitude at the love and mercy of Jesus, but we also look forward to being with Him in eternity. But if these people who never saw that promise, who never saw Christ's kingdom established, His church established, could be this faithful, how much the more should you and I be faithful, living in a time where we've seen the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies. We've seen the results of Christ coming and dying for us and being resurrected and His church being established, that we can be members of and partakers of the salvation of God. Hebrews 11, so much more that we could talk about and look at, but I would encourage you, when you're feeling low, when you're feeling a lack of faith, when you're feeling just kind of down and out, look at these people, look at these examples, read this chapter, and I think these stories of faith from these characters will inspire you not to give up. Others have persevered in faith, and we can as well. I hope this lesson has been beneficial to you. Again, I thank you for tuning in. We would invite you to tune in online again with us on Wednesday night at 7 o'clock, and next Sunday morning in person if you can, or online if you can't, at 9 a.m. for our Sunday morning worship.